In 1939, a New Yorker named Ernest Gruening headed north to be the new governor of Alaska. Back in Washington, he too often ignored the chain of command, infuriating his boss, Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes.
So he wanted to fire him, and Roosevelt was he didn't like to fire people, so he promoted him to make him governor of Alaska, which was an appointive position.
I think they thought they were sending him to the end of the world, end of the earth, and that they would never hear from him again.
Alaska was backward and neglected and not about to change. But Gruening had been there before as director of the Division of Territories and Island Possessions, and he knew what Alaska needed.
Alaska was in the grip of absentee interests and had been for a quarter of a century. They were violently opposed to any taxation that would lessen their profits or in any way interfere with their desire to take as much from Alaska as quickly as possible. The wealth of Alaska was being drained off, and next to nothing was staying there for its needs. Ernest Gruening.
Ernest Gruening was a dynamic individual who wanted to have his way. He was not in the least bit worried about upsetting the apple cart, upsetting the establishment. He just bulled his way.
He went to Harvard University, graduated at 16. Then he went to medical school to please his father. But in his junior year, he fell in love with journalism, started to work in various Boston newspapers, and after he graduated, he determined to have a career in journalism.
As the editor of The Nation magazine, he campaigned against powerful monopolies and against U.S. gunboat diplomacy in Latin America. President Roosevelt brought him into the government, where Gruening, fluent in Spanish, was instrumental in developing the president's new good neighbor policy towards Latin America. So perhaps Gruening was predisposed to understand the Alaskans, who felt like second-class citizens. They couldn't vote for the president and had no vote in Congress. The injustices riled Gruening.
It is my belief that Uncle Sam has been guilty of colonialism in Alaska. Colonialism is an ugly word and is somewhat in disrepute now. But we were born as a nation through revolt against colonialism, and I assure you that the grievances of our colonial forefathers were similar in a number of respects to those against which they protest in Alaska. Ernest Gruening.
The absentee investors owned canneries and installed floating fish-catching machines called fish traps right in the mouths of salmon-spawning streams.
It became pretty clear that the way the fish traps were operated was destroying the fish runs. And if it had been allowed to continue that way, would have eliminated our salmon industry.
The industry was not one of harvesting, but of mining the resource. When they finished with this stream, they dismantled the cannery, put it on the barge, and went to another stream and did the whole same sort of thing.
The absentees also owned the mines, the only industry with year-round jobs. The world-famous Guggenheim brothers and J.P. Morgan together owned canneries, mines, a shipping company, and a railroad. Called the Alaska Syndicate, these companies accounted for most of Alaska's economy.
So that you had the very powerful national economic and banking interests that made up the syndicate itself. And they took over the transportation and had a stranglehold on the basic economy.
Judge W.C. Arnold, director of the Alaska Salmon Industry, Inc., a trade association, is considered by many to be the most powerful man in the territory, Fortune magazine.
Because the legislature was so small, you only need to control a handful of votes in order to block anything from happening. And Arnold was the man, he was the great stopper, handing out money to legislators to get them to vote the right way.
He was on the witness stand, and one of the senators got up and said, Judge Arnold, do you have suggestions to us for what the appropriation bill should be? He said, yes, I have. He took out of his vest pocket a draft of a bill, appropriation bill, handed it to the senator. The senator turned around, handed that to the clerk, and introduced this as the appropriation bill without even reading it, and it passed. I was thunderstruck that this could have happened, And that was to me, typified the control, the stranglehold the lobbyist had on the legislature.
Anything that had to do with government had to do by memorials to the president and to the Congress. The last sentence in our memorial was, and the legislature of the Territory of Alaska forever prays to the Congress of the United States that they will pass this request. It kind of struck me funny that we had to forever pray, that we had to go through God in order to get the Congress of the United States to do something for us.
Municipalities couldn't even issue bonded indebtedness, the normal things a city would do, just to build a sewer system. And that would require an act of Congress.
It had been like that since before the gold rush.
In the studies I have made of the application of military power on and across the Pacific, Alaska stands out as the key point. Its position, halfway between America and Asia, is decisive. General Billie Mitchell.
Billie Mitchell learned about Alaska in 1901 as a young lieutenant in the Army Signal Corps helping to build a telegraph line across Alaska. He saw the same thing that in 1867 drove Secretary of State William Seward to purchase Alaska from Russia.
Seward had an insight that many did not, and that was that the United States was going to have to move to protect itself militarily in the east as well as in the west. And he had in mind Alaska would provide a potential naval base, and that could supply the northern part of the Pacific Naval Fleet that Seward imagined the U.S. would need in the future.
In 1935, Alaska's strategic location fit in with Mitchell's ambition to make America an air power.
It does not take much of a look into the future to see that he who holds Alaska holds the world, because a great expanding nation, if it becomes dominant in the air, can now achieve world dominion. General Billie Mitchell.
He understood that Alaska would be the air crossroads of the world. You couldn't fly from Asia to Europe without refueling.
Alaska's strategic value in the aviation age might have been apparent to Billie Mitchell, but Congress and the top brass weren't interested in air power or Alaska.
And he had a hard time bringing the rest of the country along with him, and in fact was court-martialed for having challenged his Army superiors who told him to stop making this argument.
However, half a world away, Japanese strategists were looking at the globe the same way as Mitchell and Seward.
In Anchorage, of course, Bob Atwood's paper came out with the big "We're in" headlines after it passed.
Alaska's largest city rocked and rolled as the air was split by the sound of sirens, horns, bells, firecrackers, guns, and everything else that could be used to make a noise. Evangeline Atwood.
Miss Alaska then climbed up the ladder and attached the star to the big flag that had been put up on the post office.
All over the state there were celebrations. Fairbanks poured some kind of dye in the Chena River, hoping to turn it gold, and I think it became mud or something. I've forgotten what it was, but it didn't dampen the enthusiasm.
You know, you just could hardly believe it. I know it was an emotional thing. I even get emotional about it. Yeah, it was pretty powerful stuff, yeah.
And so everybody in town had been hauling their old scrap lumber out up to the park strip. And right there near I Street, we piled all the lumber up. And it was a huge bonfire.
Everybody brought their children. I let them stay up and dance around that bonfire because I wanted them to remember for the rest of their lives that was in celebration of Alaska statehood.
When the actual proclamation was issued on January 3rd by President Eisenhower admitting Alaska to the Union, it was almost like a non-event in Alaska because the real celebration had been on June 30th of 1958.
Nonetheless, the people gathered at the White House for the signing ceremony were pretty happy.
Gruening was a leader, and he galvanized the public behind the idea. But Bartlett was the man on the spot in the Congress that got the Congress to do the job.
It can be said, and truthfully, that Secretary Seaton is a sincere advocate of statehood, that he has been responsible for swinging President Eisenhower around on this proposition. Bob Bartlett.
Alaska got statehood when Sam Rayburn changed his mind. Sam Rayburn was in command of the House. And next to the president, he was the most significant political figure on the entire landscape of America.
I once wrote that Bob Bartlett was the architect of statehood. I did that because he was the one who kept the dream alive in Congress, and he's the one who fashioned each statehood bill from 1944 onward. And in the end, it was his final piece of work that passed both houses of Congress.
I look back on participating in something phenomenal more than 50 years ago.
It became almost a motherhood issue, and it's too bad that every group of young people don't have such a cause. We all felt we were caught up in something, and we all felt we were very privileged to be here.
It all seems as though we had some motivation and an objective more than just payroll or a permanent fund dividend.
Here, I suppose people in the 20s and 30s, maybe 40s, don't appreciate what the statehood battle was like, and they probably don't even think of the statehood battle as anything that's of consequence.
It was a big thing, and I think the attitude that we had then was one of unity. What the future will hold is in the hands of these people who ought to learn more about the history of the state.
I would hope that they would absorb some of the idealism. We really had stars in our eyes.
What I'd want for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, of which I have a number, I'd want them to have opportunity. Our land is rich. I'd want them to have a piece of the action if they're willing to work to get it.
If there's any kind of development going on, you can bet there will be one or two suits filed in federal court to block whatever it is that Alaskans are trying to do. It has stunted our ability to achieve those goals that we hoped for when statehood came.
60% of Alaska's land is federal. That is to say, it's owned by the American people, and they can do with it what they will. And they have a perfectly legitimate concern about how what happens in Alaska might impinge on that.
Well, I hope that as we get further into this terrible energy crisis, that the country will survive and come to its senses and realize what a storehouse of energy Alaska is. Not just oil and gas, but coal and wind power and tidal power.
I think Alaska, since statehood, has done a good job managing its fisheries, but I think the next 50 years are going to be the ones we have to worry about. With resource development coming online, we need to be very cautious if we're going to have a sustainable wild fishery and be one of the last places on Earth to have one.
First of all, let's remember what most of us came here for. We came here for the beauty, the physical beauty, the natural resources, the splendor of its wildlife, the untrammeled lifestyle.
To keep these open spaces there and not have private ownership become the ultimate lockup of Alaska.
I think we can chart our own course in the world and be a model with the things like the permanent fund or the permanent fund dividend. But in the end, we have to deal with the same problems that are global problems, and I hope Alaska takes the lead in dealing with things like global warming and species eradication, and frankly, I'm concerned that we're not doing that.
I'm by nature an optimist, and I believe in statehood. I am also optimistic about the future of Native peoples to remain Native peoples, even as they evolve, while still being Alaskans in the large sense, that all Alaskans of whatever race, of whatever ethnicity, are able to live in this place together, respecting those things and celebrating those things that they hold in common. If we build on that, and if we continue that into the future, Alaska will be an incredibly great place.